One of the great books that I've read about Michelangelo, and specifically about the creation of the David, or his David, or David, is this book called Il Gigante, which translated means like the big one. And that's what they called it when he was working on it. It was like kind of a mystery. He had it like covered, and he worked on it for nearly 3 years, from 1501 to 1504, and he was between 21 and 24 years old. Oh, sorry, a correction. He was between 26 to 28, I guess, because 75, 20, yeah, so young man before his 30s, really making his bones. And this book is all about Michelangelo, Florence, and the David, 1492 to 1504. So he studied in this studio atelier of Lorenzo the Magnificent, who was a Medici. The Medicis notable for being, I guess, landlords and merchants. Machiavelli's Prince was written for one of the Medicis as a guide to how to keep territory and poison other princes and so forth. So, but this guy was very well beloved. I think he died kind of young, and while like he passed away while Michelangelo was still a youth. So so that's kind of like, so it's Florence in Italy, and Florence is really like blooming. It's like a port town. It's got like lots of rich merchants, a lot, like it's really New York City of its day, I mean, it was like a world destination, especially for merchants and rich, people and ships and so forth. So anybody who was like in the vicinity, they wanted to kind of place themselves in history, and they wanted to build mausoleums for themselves or build churches, like, clergymen wanted to build churches in Florence, buildings, monuments, and so forth to, their achievements, the ones that settled in the region. So yeah, it was a great time for artists because people had an abundance of money, and when there's money, art can flourish because then there's no restrictions. Then it's like, look, like you don't have to worry about like money so much. You could just like give the best work that you can. Although in the book, Michelangelo still had to deal with like BS from certain patrons. It's likely because the patrons were jerks in a lot of cases. Like famously, Da Vinci had a lot of unfinished works. So it's possible. It's one of the reasons. So anyway, Michelangelo, he's a young man. He's doing like interesting work in his atelier. He's doing works like this in his teens still. He goes off to Rome, and what he considers a bit of a failure, he does the Pieta here. He does the Pieta, but he comes back to Florence because he ran out of money in Rome. And so he's, a young guy. That happens to like college people, college age people, go off to college. You spend like, if you took out a loan, you spend your money like before the spring semester's done, and you're broke and you got to go back home. At least like, even if your parents don't have too much money, at least, you're going to manage in your hometown. So it's one of those deals. So back around that time was interesting was Da Vinci had also moved back from Paris back to Florence because Da Vinci's, well, from Vinci, Da Vinci. So he moved back to Florence, but he was about like 20 plus years Michelangelo's senior at that time. But he was very influential. So he voted to get, like, to give away commissions and so forth within the city. So basically there was this big stone for about 70 years, this big old stone, Il Gigante. It might have been called like Il Gigante before, but it was like this big old stone, and somebody, one artist had tried before to kind of pick away at it, and was unsuccessful. Like, they never finished it, so it's hard to tell like the pose that the original artist had tried, but they didn't get too far, in the chiseling of it. Like, they didn't really build this. So this is what Michelangelo came up with. I think originally it was meant to be at the top of a building, one of the buildings, but it ended up like just residing in this garden of like some other building. I forget the detail. You have to read the book yourself. Extremely well written book. It's very compelling at every step. Great writer, Anton Gil, and I'm looking forward to tracking down some of his other books on subjects that I'm interested in. He's got some other ones, The Great Escape, Peggy Guggenheim, that might be interesting. And then some other ones. It's hard to tell by the titles who they're based on, but he writes history, and he did such a nice job of writing about this artist, Michelangelo. So they had tried to chisel away at it and didn't get very far at all. And Michelangelo, now that he's back, he's a sculptor primarily. Although I'm sure like he learned painting in the atelier in Lorenzo the Magnificent's art school, but this is what he was making his bones in. And incidentally, there's a passage in here where Da Vinci's quoted as describing sculptors as like dusty laborers, basically. Da Vinci was a bit of a snob, to sculptors. And sculpting just wasn't an art form. To a lot of extent, Michelangelo elevated sculpting in that period, because the Belvedere torso had been like unearthed, several years before. So artists were now renewally inspired by the figure, whereas the admiration of the figure, which there's some great Greek sculptures that really illustrate the figure, and the Spartans and so forth, they loved the male figure and the female figure alike. Like during the Dark Ages, it was just all iconography mostly, so there wasn't as much admiration, and so sculpture was coming back, and Michelangelo had a lot to do with that, and especially the David. Anyway, he got the commission. It was mostly like he would hide it and just whittle away at it for the better part of 2 to 3 years. It was a big old piece, and it just is a huge hit. So one thing that I learned recently from a friend of mine that visited Florence and saw the piece, and in the tour that he had, they said that part of the reason the head was very big and the hands were big were that they had to be readable from a distance, because if this would have been on top of a building, like an icon on top of a building, then these are features that you would have to read from a distance. Now, for many years, I always thought the hands, the analysis was that it's like it's David, he's a young man, and he's like, when young men are growing, they grow disproportionately, like sometimes like lanky young boys, they'll have like big feet, all of a sudden, but the rest of their body hasn't caught up, so they got like skinny legs and torsos, and then their hands may be big all of a sudden too. But then everything hasn't filled in yet. And I always thought, in my youth, maybe I read that somewhere, that's what I thought, like the hands were like that. But then over time, as an artist, I analyzed the hands, especially, this hand. It's so manly, and I figured simply that it was that way because I've done this in my own artworks where, let's say I remember one in particular where I was painting a female figure. I was doing a live painting. So it was like an event, there's music in the background, I was doing a live painting, but it was a realistic painting. And she had like a gesture with her hand like this. She was holding like an object. And I needed to do the pose myself so I could kind of visualize it, I didn't want to do any guesswork, so I did the gesture, and in doing that, mentally, it affected my painting because the hand looks a little bit more masculine than a female's hand would look because of my mental reference. It's like as an artist, if you do the gesture, you kind of take a photograph, like a mental photograph, a snapshot. So you memorize that, you commit that to your mind, and then it's almost like you superimpose it on top of the painting and you visualize that image. So that was one thing that I assumed was happening, and it might be a combination. I mean, there's definitely a lot of reference. There's no way you can get anything this good anywhere, without high levels of observation, about anatomy and certain things he just got into. Like he was just like, I mean, you could feel like the weight of that hand. It's just phenomenal. So anyway. Yeah, he knocked it out of the park, basically. I mean, that's like, I don't know what else to say. This is interesting. In the book, they kind of go through other renditions of the David before this, so everything was like kind of feminine and but this was just like, I mean, it was sexy, like, I mean, it's got like this masculine like appeal. Where this is like what are they, girls? Like look at this. With that pose. That pose is like ridiculous. Like how does somebody posing like that take down a giant? I saw this other like documentary. I believe it was like some guy, something Maxwell, and he wrote a book about David, and he was David and Goliath, separate from art, like the actual historical David and Goliath. And Maxwell or something, I forget the author's name. What he discovered apparently through research was that, the David and Goliath was an occurrence, but Goliath might have been just like a big dumb oaf, like maybe possibly deaf and like kind of, mentally, for lack of a better word, retarded. Like he was just like maybe autistic or something like that. Like he was kind of like Andre the Giant, but with less intelligence. Like he might have had like kind of mental deficiencies because of like the gigantism that he had going on. So he was like this big guy that they just kind of like pushed forward against this young marksman. basically. So it wasn't actually that mismatched, David versus Goliath, as it might have initially appear. In fact, it's when somebody's like that big and dumb, it's a disadvantage. And when David, who's like a youth that's like an excellent marksman, it's quite a strategic move to like put him to shoot a rock at this guy's forehead and knock him out. So, it's a brilliant piece. One thing that I like, there's this poem, I'm going to read the whole thing to you, but the last 3 lines, I actually quoted in my book, It's a Living, because I loved it so much. And to me, the last 3 lines are, well, they're relative to my story, but I feel like this is kind of, this poem encompasses well like Michelangelo's relationship with his art, I think. With heart of sulfur and with flesh of tow, with bone designed of dry and rotting wood, with spirit lacking any guide to show which impulses are evil and which good, with reason which displays itself so weak, confronted with a world so full of snares, it is no wonder that my flesh should break when it first stumbles on such furious fires. With glorious art, that gift received from heaven, that conquers nature and in every way clings to all human longing and desire. If such a gift I truly have been given, and yet divided, torn, still burn and stray, he is to blame who fashioned me for fire. So I love that last line. What the key thing is like that gift received from heaven. So that was one of the things that Michelangelo believed in. He was a very pious man. He had 0 relationships, like sexual relationships, throughout his life, as far as history knows. He had one muse that was like a young model. I want to say like Chevalier or something like that his name was, that he used to write love letters to when he was much older. Like Michelangelo was in his 60s, the guy was like in his 20s or 30s or something. And I guess the artist would indulge him. But yeah, what he believed was that, and you see it in his later sculptures, what he believed was like that the sculpture was underneath. So you just had to chisel it away and dust off the debris, because the artwork was underneath. So when he would pick out stones, he would choose the stone where he could visualize a shape in there and the pose, and then he would visualize it so thoroughly that he would just sculpt it away. I mean, I guess he did, sketches, but generally he was like, he would visualize and he would claim that God would lead him to these artworks, to these masterpieces. So with Il Gigante, there are very few sketches that were found. Let's see, I think there might have been one. This is, I think, might be the only sketch available that's close to the ideas that he had for the David. And you see the hand. This is probably like meant to be like upside down, So they just listed it that way. So there it is. There's that hand. Much different than it turned out, because like when he made it here, it's like he didn't want to screw that up, right? Well, he didn't want to screw up anything, to be honest. So yeah, there it is. He really, yeah, it's a masterpiece, So it put him on the map, and then he was able to return eventually to Rome and do the Sistine Chapel and a lot of great things besides that. So this is a great book. I think, like, with some nostalgia, I would love to like sit down with it again. It was a pleasure to read. Very educational, but like just well written. You know, really placed you in Florence at the time. You know, Da Vinci back in town. Not really a fan of Michelangelo. Michelangelo, a young man trying to establish himself, trying to make a name for himself. And this was the piece that he did it with, the David. Because the Pieta made an impression, but, you know, he had to kind of scurry home from Rome, so it's just like, okay, you leave behind one work. But he hadn't like really launched himself properly from Florence, and this is the piece that launched him properly. Like now, he could, you know, this was noticeable enough as a great work of art that he could get big commissions and not struggle in Rome from now on.